Hi everyone, it's Eliana again with card number 3 from the Simon Says Stamp Card Kit. For this card, I am just taking my card front and I'm just drawing a line around the edge so that I know what my stamping area is. I'm taking the Merry Christmas sentiment from the stamp set and I'm just lining it up onto the front of my card. And then I'm removing the card panel and then I am using the lines on the grid paper to line up my stamp. I'm picking up the stamp with the lid of MISTI and then I'm checking the placement with the lines on the grid just to double check that it is straight. I am inking up my stamp with New Moon pigment ink from Avery L. And I've stamped my image, but I want it to be just a little bit darker, and so I re-ink my stamp. I put a shim behind my card front and I ink it up again. Now that I'm happy with that, I'm going to use the sparkle embossing powder that I've been using the last few cards, and I'm going to emboss the sentiment on the front of the card. And once I'm done melting the embossing powder, I'm not very concerned with warping my card because I'm going to emboss it using a snowflake embossing folder from Cuttlebug. Now I take this over to my Big Shot and I emboss it. And once it's embossed, I trim down my piece to 3 1/4 inches. I'm going to use the remainder of my cardstock to make my card panel, and I'm just taking a 4 1/4 by 11 inch piece of paper tray ink craft cardstock, and I've just scored it and folded it in half. You could use the craft cardstock that comes in the kit, but I wanted something just a little bit thicker, and the one in the kit is not as dark as this craft cardstock. Now you see me use a scrap piece of white cardstock and I've just inked it up with my Versamark, and I'm going to pour my Gold Recollections embossing powder onto my strip, and I'm going to make my own gold paper, and I'm just going to heat it up with my heat gun. And once that is done, I am just going to cut it right in half, and because the strip is so small, I just adhere it to my trimmer with a small piece of post-it tape. Now this is the very last piece of the red pattern paper that came in the kit, and I'm just trimming down a 1/4 inch of this paper, and I'm just going to use it as a small little border strip. I've also trimmed down some of the blue pattern paper that has all the text on it, and I just trimmed off sections of it where you have a row of words throughout the whole thing. Now I'm adhering the gold paper I created to the very edges of my card front. I used the Paper Tray Ink Stamper Select cardstock to make my gold strips just because it was a little bit thicker and I knew that it wouldn't warp as much as the thinner cardstock. So once it's adhered, I trim off anything that overhangs the edge of the card. And now I want to see what order I want to put my strips in. And so here is that text cardstock I was telling you about. And I'm not sure whether I want the red in between or against the craft cardstock. So I'm just testing it out, and so I just do one on each side, and I'm just going to see which one I like better. And I end up liking the red cardstock right up against the craft. And I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to adhere all these pieces together, because I'm going to need to foam mount my panel to the front of my card because I'm going to put some twine on my card. And I start off by adhering the thin red strips to my card panel directly. Once the red strips of pattern paper are adhered to the embossed piece of cardstock, I start to wonder how I'm going to get the blue pattern paper on there, because there is not enough pattern paper to adhere it under the card front. I end up taking a thin piece of cardstock that measures 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I adhere all my pieces to the front of that card panel. That way I have something entire or something solid to put foam dots or foam adhesive underneath. So once that is in place, it just looks like it's a little crooked to me. Since I didn't use a ruler to adhere my little strips together, I use the lines of my grid paper of my grid mat to check to see if it's lined up. And you can see that the blue panel, the blue strip on the right hand side is not straight. And so now I rip off the craft piece of cardstock, and I'm going to take off the strips that are on the right, but the ATG adhesive is stuck on there really well, and so the red paper starts to tear, and so I just end up carefully peeling up the blue pattern paper. So I put adhesive back onto that little strip, and there is a little bit of cardstock on there, and so I just kind of roll it off. And now I'm using the grid squares on my mat, or the lines on my mat, to line up that blue strip. And once that's on there, I could go back and add my embossed cardstock. And what I end up with is some overhanging white, and I'm just going to use my Fisker's guillotine trimmer to trim that off. The small paper trimmer works really well because you could use the edge of the blade to line up where you want to cut, and it usually does a pretty good job. And if you're off by a little bit, you could actually cut just small slivers, just like I'm doing here. And what I should have done is trim down my card front just a tiny bit, since I had cut down the length of my card, and you could see where it's going to cause a problem later on. So now I'm going to work on the focal point of my card front, and I'm just taking the smallest die from the Spellbinders Nestability standard circle dies, and this is the large set. And I tried using a 1-inch hole punch, but it was just too big, and this one's just a little bit smaller, I think. I'm not sure, but this ended up being the perfect size that I wanted. Now I've pulled out my favorite holiday punch from Stampin' Up, and I've used this punch a lot. I pretty much use it every year I make Christmas cards. And I tried punching out the transparency with the punch, but it just doesn't cut all the way around. And so I just took a small square piece, and I just cut it with my scissors. And I thought I would be so smart and use my spray adhesive to adhere that transparency to the front of the card. But then I end up with a glob of adhesive on my thumb, and I get it on the transparency. And so I got to cut another little strip off. And I'm trying not to touch the transparency. And once I get it down in place, I clean off my fingers. And this is where the spray adhesive was a total mess. I'm trying to cut the transparency so that you don't see it, and I can't get my scissors wedged underneath the punch shape. And so it was a bit of a mess. But when I finally get it trimmed off, you can't even tell. Now I need to find my little bunny off of the pattern paper that will fit perfectly behind the circle that's in the middle of the embellishment. And I'm trying to find a bunny so that I'm not cutting into the middle of the pattern paper. And I end up finding that little bunny right up there at the very top. And I just kind of keep my thumb over it so that I know where to cut around. And once I get my little bunny cut, I need to place it right behind the opening of my little shaker. And so what I do is just add adhesive to the very back of the pattern paper, and I'm just going to line it up and place it onto another punched ornament, and it's just a plain white one. And once I get it visible through the little hole, then I just trim the extra pattern paper around, and that will be the back of my ornament shaker. Now I need to add the gold top to my ornament, and so I just pull out my embossing, my Versamark marker out, and I'm going to just color the top of the ornament. But before I do that, I notice that there's a little bit of the transparency sticking out from the very edge of the ornament, and it's just bothering me, and so I had to trim it off. Once I've colored the top of the ornament, I'm just going to dip the ornament into the bottle of embossing powder, and I'm just going to heat emboss that. And it doesn't take long because my heat gun is still warm from the last time, but I notice that there's a little corner that's just not gold, and so I go back and I color the ornament again and emboss the top again. And once that's done, I need to add the foam tape to the back of the ornament to create my shaker. I'm just taking a small piece of foam, and I'm not double mounting it because I don't want the ornament to be very bulky. And I'm just taking small strips and going all the way around the ornament. When doing this, you want to make sure that all of the foam tape butts up against the other piece. That way none of the glitter falls out. Before adding the glitter, you want to make sure that there are no fingerprints on the transparency because it's such a small opening. You don't want a big fingerprint in the middle of it, and so I use my shirt sleeve to just wipe the little opening just to make sure that it's clean. And I'm going to be adding just a couple of pinches of the diamond dust glitter that I got at a garage sale. And I wish I would have put a little bit more in there, but I didn't want to take my shaker apart. And so there's just a little bit in there, enough so that you could see it's a shaker card. And once that is complete, I need to add my twine to hang my ornament. You can make a lot of these little shaker ornaments with the pattern paper that came in the kit. I did make a green one earlier, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to put a green one or a red one on here, and so I'm just testing it out, and I do like the red one better, especially with the little red strips of paper. And now I need to decide whether I want to use the gold twine from the twinery or if I want to use this red baker's twine from Lawn Fawn. And this red one matches perfectly with the papers that come in the kit. It's made by Lawn Fawn, and that's what the pattern papers are. And so what I am doing is that I'm just tying my twine around the top of the ornament, and I find that if I go left over right and then turn whatever it is I'm tying over, my bow sits flat. And so that's just a small trick. So just go ahead and do your knot first, then turn it over or flip it upside down, and then tie the rest of your bow, and you'll see that your bow usually sits flatter, and the loops usually are a little go in the right direction. So I've just used my ribbon scissors to trim my twine, and now I need to add the hanger, or the top part of the twine where it'll be hanging from the top of the card on the back of the ornament. And I at first wanted to try to lay it flat, but then I decide that I want to add a little dimension because I don't want the ornament to sit wonky with the twine going behind it. So I'm just adding some foam adhesive, and I'm adding 2 little strips at the very top so that the twine could go right between that little channel there, and I know that it's going to sit straight on the card, and I don't have to worry about how the twine is going to go behind the ornament. And so once I get all of my foam on there, I go ahead and remove the backing, and now I'm just going to place my ornament right above the sentiment. Now I just wrap my twine right behind the front panel of the card, and I'm just going to use a small piece of the score tape to hold it in place. And now I need to adhere the panel to the front of my card, and so I'm just going to run this foam adhesive along the edges, and I'm just using the whole strip so that it looks neat when the recipient gets it. It's not sloppy behind the foam. And I'm careful to on how I add the foam to the very top so that it's not bulky where that little piece of twine is. And once that's done, I am going to adhere this to the front of my card front, and I really get it on there not so straight, and so it ends up bothering me, and you'll see how I struggle to get the front of my card straight. And so I'm trying to put it on here, but I can't see if I'm even, and so then I decide to go this way, and I'm trying to line it up, but I can't see the top of the card, and I end up being off by just a little bit. And so I am going to try to trim where I'm off, and because there are so many layers, I can't get my trimmer to go through, and so now I'm left with this tiny little piece that I end up having to trim with my scissors. And still, I'm not happy with how it looks because the left is just a little bit thinner than the right, and so now I'm going to try to trim it. But I can't see how much I'm off, and I am off on both sides, so it looks a little bit crooked on both sides. And so now I'm trying to trim it off with my craft knife, and it's just, I can't do it. And so now I pull out my big trimmer, and I'm going to trim it using that, and I can't get through the multiple layers. And so now I'm going to use my craft knife to trim the remainder of what the trimmer wouldn't go through. And then I just decide that close enough. And what you don't see is that before I take my picture for my card, I end up totally taking it apart and re-adhering it to the front of the card so that it is perfectly straight, because it was just bothering me. There's my OCD again. And so I'm sorry that this video is a little bit longer than normal, and I hope that that is okay. Here's a close-up of my card. And thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and head on over to the blog and subscribe there for updates. Thanks for watching.